James Chun stood behind the counter at Miller's family kitchen, his hands resting on the edge as he stared out into the dining room, bustling with the usual hum of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of dishes. His dream had always been simple: to create a space where food brought people together, not driven them apart. His kitchen had been a sanctuary for the community, a place where good food and shared moments healed wounds and created connections. But that was before the call. The offer came just days ago, a request to cater a private dinner for Donald Trump. James's heart sank the moment he heard the name. The very thought of serving Trump felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in: compassion, empathy, and standing firm in his values. Yet, how could he turn away an opportunity that could bring his restaurant even more recognition? He knew his staff would be divided, his patrons could turn against him, and his reputation would be questioned. As the days passed, the conflict inside James grew stronger. He wasn't just battling with a decision to accept or refuse the dinner. It was more profound than that. He was questioning his own identity, the essence of why he opened this restaurant in the first place. Was food just about feeding people? Or was it about creating something deeper, something more meaningful? James had always looked up to Margaret Wilson, his culinary mentor and the guiding force behind Miller's family kitchen. Margaret's lessons extended far beyond cooking techniques. She believed that food was a bridge between generations, between different walks of life, and even between conflicting beliefs. Her stories of teaching and nurturing James shaped the very foundation of who he was as a chef. She taught him that food could heal, unite, and transcend divisive boundaries. Margaret's kitchen was a place of refuge. It was where James had first found his calling, kneading dough alongside her, listening to her tales of struggle and triumph, and learning the delicate balance of flavors that could evoke memories and create bonds. Those lessons weren't just about culinary precision, they were about soul, about making people feel seen, understood, and valued. One evening, as James sat in his office, staring at a blank sheet of paper, he felt paralyzed by the weight of his thoughts. He began to write, but the words felt hollow and formal. To the New York restaurant community, my loyal customers, and everyone who has supported Miller's family kitchen over the years. He crumpled the paper, his frustration mounting. It wasn't enough to express the depth of his turmoil. He remembered Margaret's words: food made with anger nourishes nothing but hate. Food made with love can heal the deepest wound. And for the first time, James realized that his decision wasn't just about politics or public opinion. It was about whether he could continue to cook with that same kind of love, the love that Margaret had instilled in him. The following morning, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, a photo of Margaret in her room at Pine Valley, surrounded by old photographs. She was smiling peacefully. The message read, "She's resting now, but she wanted you to have this." Dorothy, her closest friend and James's connection to Margaret's final moments, later brought James the photo in person. That moment brought clarity. Margaret's legacy wasn't just about recipes or technique. It was about the love behind every meal, the lessons she imparted through stories, and the healing power of understanding. James knew he had to step beyond his initial convictions. Margaret's influence had always been more than about the food. Her kitchen had been a sanctuary for troubled souls, a refuge for those seeking comfort and connection. And as the weight of the moment pressed down on him, James realized the decision was no longer about Trump. It was about Margaret's wisdom, her guiding hand from beyond the kitchen walls, urging him to recognize the truth hidden beneath his stubborn beliefs. As the day approached, James surrounded himself with the memories of Margaret's teachings. He thought about the countless Sundays they spent together cooking her famous meatloaf, peeling carrots, and layering vegetables with tender precision. It was those simple, loving acts that had the power to transcend even the most bitter divides. The offer to serve Trump, to cook for a man whose policies and actions James had deeply opposed, seemed overwhelming at first. But as he reflected on Margaret's lessons, he realized that food was not a weapon of division. It was a tool for connection. Margaret had once told him, "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we were wrong." James's heart ached at the thought of betraying her teachings, of ignoring the truth that she had so passionately passed on to him. And so, as the call loomed, James found himself on the edge of a decision that would redefine his purpose as a chef, and more importantly, as a human being. James Chin's decision to refuse the dinner invitation for Donald Trump wasn't just an act of defiance. It felt like a stand for his beliefs. But it didn't come without consequences. Word spread quickly in their small, tight-knit town. Miller's family kitchen was no stranger to controversy. But this time, the stakes felt higher. Longtime patrons whispered in hushed tones. Employees exchanged nervous glances. And even James's own family questioned the wisdom of his choice. The local newspaper even ran a piece with the headline, "Chef declines to cook for president, hero or villain?" "Dad, maybe this isn't about you," his daughter Amy had said over dinner one night. She'd been silent for most of the meal, but the weight of her words landed heavily. "I get why you're upset, but maybe this isn't just about Trump. Maybe it's about what you're trying to prove." Her words echoed in James's mind as he stood in the kitchen late that night, staring at Margaret's old recipe cards. They were worn with age, smudged with grease and fingerprints, but to him, they were a testament to a simpler time, a time when food was about love, not politics. He picked up her card for meatloaf, the edges curling slightly, and traced the faded ink with his finger. He could almost hear her voice, "A pinch of this, a dash of that. Trust your instincts, James. But never forget, the secret ingredient is love." Those words had stayed with him all his life, but now they felt almost mocking. Where was the love in a world so divided? James's refusal wasn't impulsive. It was deeply rooted in years of personal struggle. His parents had immigrated to the U.S. in the 1970s, opening the first version of Miller's Family Kitchen in a small storefront. Over time, the restaurant had become a cultural melting pot, drawing regulars from all walks of life. But with success came challenges. James had seen firsthand how prejudice and stereotypes could taint even the purest of dreams. When he inherited the restaurant after his parents' passing, he vowed to honor their legacy by ensuring that the kitchen remained a place of unity. To him, cooking for someone like Trump felt like a betrayal of that promise. Still, doubt began creeping in. Dorothy, Margaret's longtime friend and caregiver, visited him at the restaurant a few days later, holding a small, neatly wrapped package in her hands. "Margaret wanted you to have this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's not doing well, James. She's been asking for you." James unwrapped the package to find Margaret's personal recipe book. Its pages were filled with her handwritten notes, little doodles in the margins, and reminders of her life's work. Tucked inside was a note. "James, food made with anger nourishes nothing but hate. Food made with love can heal the deepest wounds. Use these recipes well, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we were wrong. With love, Margaret." The words struck a chord deep within him. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. Margaret had always been his moral compass, and even now, in her frailty, she was guiding him toward the truth. That evening, James decided to visit Margaret at Pine Valley Hospice. The drive was quiet, the air thick with unspoken questions and the lingering scent of rain. When he arrived, he found her sitting in her room, surrounded by photographs and mementos of her life. Her frail hands clutched a picture of the two of them in her old kitchen. "James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," he replied, pulling up a chair beside her. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Margaret smiled faintly. "You've always been stubborn, just like me." She gestured to the photograph in her lap. "Do you remember that day?" James nodded, his throat tightening. It was the day he'd told her he wanted to become a chef. He'd been nervous, afraid she'd laugh at him, but instead, she'd taken him by the hand and said, "If that's your dream, then you'll build it, just like we build meals, one ingredient at a time." "Margaret, I'm lost," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. I turned down the dinner because it didn't feel right. But now," he trailed off, unable to find the words. Margaret's hand rested on his. "James, food is about connection. It's about bringing people together, not driving them apart. Sometimes, the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very things that keep us from seeing the truth." Her words hung in the air as James sat back, feeling the weight of her wisdom. It wasn't about Trump, or politics, or making a statement. It was about love, the kind of love that transcends disagreements and bridges divides. Margaret had always believed in the power of food to heal, and she was asking James to carry that torch. The next morning, James made his decision. He called the event coordinator to accept the request. The team was stunned by his reversal, but James was resolute. "We're not just serving dinner," he told his staff. "We're honoring Margaret's legacy. We're cooking with love." The preparation process was unlike anything James had experienced before. He dove into Margaret's recipe book, rediscovering dishes he hadn't made in years. Each recipe felt like a piece of her, a reminder of her laughter, her strength, and her unyielding belief in the power of food. He shared stories of Margaret with his team, encouraging them to approach their work with the same heart and dedication. Slowly but surely, the tension that had gripped the kitchen began to ease. When the day of the dinner arrived, the atmosphere was electric. James and his team worked tirelessly, ensuring every detail was perfect. The menu featured a blend of Margaret's classics and James's own creations, each dish carefully chosen to reflect their shared philosophy. As the guests began to arrive, James took a moment to step back and observe. The room was filled with laughter and conversation, a stark contrast to the animosity he'd feared. During the dinner, James couldn't help but notice Trump's reaction to the food. There was a moment when the former president paused, savoring a bite of meatloaf. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. After the meal, Trump approached James in the kitchen. "I don't know what you put in that meatloaf," he said, "but it tasted like home." James nodded, his heart full. "It's an old family recipe," he replied, "passed down with love." That night, as James locked up the restaurant, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in weeks. The dinner had been more than just a meal. It had been a bridge, a chance to connect with others on a human level. Margaret's legacy had guided him through one of the most challenging moments of his career, and for that, he was deeply grateful. The next morning, James wrote his resignation letter, but instead of anger or defiance, it was filled with gratitude. He thanked his staff, his patrons, and most of all, Margaret. "I've learned that the bravest thing we can do is open our hearts," he wrote. "Margaret taught me that food is love, and love is what heals." As James locked up Miller's family kitchen for the last time, he carried with him Margaret's recipe book, her apron, and the understanding that true courage isn't about standing firm. It's about being willing to change. And somewhere, he liked to think, Margaret was smiling, her legacy of love living on in every meal he'd ever cook. James Chun sat alone in his office late that night, surrounded by the faint hum of the kitchen's cooling appliances. The dinner was over. Margaret's recipes had been served, her legacy celebrated, and the tension that had once consumed him had melted away into something he couldn't quite name. But the weight of his resignation letter, still sitting untouched on his desk, reminded him that the story wasn't yet complete. He ran his fingers over the envelope, hesitating. Writing that letter had been an act of clarity, born out of weeks of internal struggle. Yet now, after everything that had transpired, he wondered if it was still the right thing to do. The dinner had unfolded in ways James hadn't anticipated. From the moment Donald Trump walked into the restaurant, James braced himself for confrontation, a comment, a look, something that would confirm his doubts. But instead, Trump's demeanor had surprised him. He wasn't the larger-than-life caricature James had built in his mind. He was quieter, more introspective, and strangely human. The room buzzed with conversation as the first course was served, Margaret's signature vegetable soup. James's staff had recreated it with meticulous care, following her handwritten instructions to the letter. As bowls were set before the guests, James watched from the kitchen, his heart pounding. Trump took a spoonful, paused, and then leaned over to one of his aides, murmuring something James couldn't hear. But the small smile that crossed Trump's face was unmistakable. It wasn't until the main course, Margaret's meatloaf, that the true magic happened. James had spent hours perfecting the dish, ensuring every bite carried the love and care Margaret had always insisted was the most important ingredient. As plates were cleared and conversations grew livelier, Trump's voice rose above the din. "Who cooked this?" he asked, his tone curious rather than demanding. James hesitated. For weeks, he'd wrestled with what he would say if confronted. But now, standing behind the kitchen door, he realized he didn't need a rehearsed speech. He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped into the dining room. "I did," he said, meeting Trump's gaze. Trump studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It tastes like my childhood." His voice was softer than James expected, almost wistful. "My nanny used to make meatloaf just like this. What's your secret?" James's throat tightened. He glanced at Margaret's photo on the wall, her smile radiating warmth. "It's not my recipe," he admitted. "It belonged to Margaret Wilson, the woman who taught me everything I know about cooking. She believed that food wasn't just about sustenance, it was about love. That's the real secret." Trump nodded again, his expression unreadable. "She sounds like an incredible woman." "She was," James said, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "She passed away last night." This dinner was her legacy. As the night wore on, James found himself in conversations he never thought he'd have. Guests shared stories of their own connections to food, how a grandmother's recipe had brought a family together, how a simple meal had mended a broken friendship. Even Trump, who had seemed so distant at first, opened up about his childhood, recounting memories of his mother's kitchen with an unexpected tenderness. By the time dessert was served, Margaret's famous apple pie, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The divisions that had felt so insurmountable just hours earlier seemed to blur, replaced by a sense of shared humanity. James watched as people from opposite ends of the political spectrum laughed together, exchanging stories over slices of pie. It was a scene Margaret would have cherished. After the last guest left, James's staff gathered in the kitchen, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and pride. Sandra, his sous chef, broke the silence. "Chef, that was something else." James nodded, unable to find the right words. Instead, he reached for Margaret's recipe book, holding it up for them to see. "This is why we do what we do," he said. "Not for recognition, not for politics, but for moments like tonight, for connection." Back in his office, James stared at the resignation letter once more. The events of the evening had left him changed, but the question remained. Could he continue to lead the restaurant while staying true to the lessons Margaret had taught him? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Amy stepped in, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You okay, Dad?" James managed a small smile. "Just thinking." She glanced at the letter on his desk. "Are you still going to resign?" James leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Tonight reminded me of why I started this journey in the first place, but it also made me realize how far I've strayed from what really matters." Amy sat across from him, her eyes bright with understanding. "Whatever you decide, just remember, Margaret believed in you, and so do I." Her words brought a lump to his throat. He reached across the desk and took her hand. "Thank you, Amy. That means more than you know." The next morning, James made his decision. He called a staff meeting before the restaurant opened, gathering his team in the dining room. The resignation letter was nowhere in sight. "Last night was a turning point," he began. "Not just for me, but for all of us. Margaret's recipes reminded us of what food can do, how it can heal, connect, and transform. I've been so focused on taking a stand that I forgot the real reason I became a chef. It's not about making statements. It's about making memories." He took a deep breath, letting his words settle. "I'm not resigning," he continued, "but I am changing how we do things here. From now on, this restaurant isn't just about serving food. It's about serving love. Every dish we make will carry Margaret's spirit, her belief in the power of food to bring people together." The room erupted in applause, his staff's faces alight with renewed purpose. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he knew he was on the right path. As the day unfolded, James and his team prepared the restaurant for its next chapter. Margaret's recipe book took its place of honor in the kitchen, a reminder of the lessons she'd imparted. And though James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he felt ready to face it with love, humility, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from standing firm, but from opening one's heart. Somewhere, James liked to think, Margaret was smiling, her legacy living on in every dish that left his kitchen.